My first video on this freaking channel that I just made, I will go through a tier list of like my personal favorite and least favorite dynasties of China, because that's what this whole account's going to be about. That's just kind of like how I'm going to get my opinion into this before I start going through all the factual stuff. So we're going to go from the first dynasty all the way to the last one, and yeah, that's kind of it. So let's get going. The first dynasty is the Shad dynasty, and they were kind of like mythical, but they didn't really do a whole lot after they were formed. Their first leader, Yu the Great, he did solve a flood that was going on in China that had been going on for like decades by that point. But after him, the dynasty was just kind of like quiet. They didn't really do all that much after that. So I think that because of that, we can sit Shy at like a comfortable B tier, and we'll just kind of keep it at that. Next is the Shang dynasty, which actually did do quite a bit culturally. They conquered several tribes surrounding China, and they expanded it into Shandong and more close to the eastern Chinese coast. And they also did a lot of bronze work at the time. However, they were eventually overthrown by the Duke of the West, who formed the Zhou dynasty, since their king was apparently a kind of like a tyrant who made a lake of alcohol, like the last leader of the Shad dynasty did. But that was kind of one of the things that came with late dynasty corruption. So I don't really know if you can pin that on them, but I think that we can set the Shang at A tier. The Zhou dynasty that ended up overthrowing the Shang wasn't really all that great. It was the longest out of all of the dynasties, but that was only really because their king was kind of like a puppet ruler to the surrounding states. The Zhou king was pretty powerful for the first few centuries of the dynasty, but after that, after they relocated their capital to Luoyang, the whole thing started to really go downhill, and the states that existed as dukes and kings within the Zhou dynasty kind of started growing more and more autonomous and installed their own kingdoms until the Warring States period broke out, which led to the Qin dynasty eventually uniting them all. So I don't think that the Zhou was all that great, since there was a lot of bloodshed and within that period, and towards like the entire second half of the empire, the king didn't really exist as an entity. The other kingdoms recognized him, but towards the end of the dynasty, they all started declaring independence until the king was eventually annexed by the Qin state. So I think we can sit Zhou at a D tier. Not quite low enough to be an E or an F, because it was the longest out of all the dynasties, but then again, it just wasn't all that great. Alright, now we're moving on to one of the worst dynasties, the Qin dynasty. This one was probably the shortest, or one of the shortest, of the formal dynasties of China. It was very powerful for its first like 10 years of its existence, but it was very unstable. Qin Shi Huang, he was the first imperial ruler of China. He created an empire after conquering the state of Qi and Yan, which unified China after several years of warfare. But after him, the whole thing fell apart in less than 10 years. His lead was succeeded by Qin Ershi, who was extremely incompetent and eventually forced to kill himself by one of his advisors. And then his successor, Zi Ying, he pretty much surrendered his whole title of emperor and declared himself as a king before he surrendered his territory as a whole to Liu Bang of the Han dynasty. So it just wasn't that great of a dynasty. So we're going to set it down at an F tier. It was very bad. Like, it wasn't a good time to be a Chinese peasant. And it's no wonder that they got overthrown immediately after their big tough guy of a ruler died. Speaking of him, he only died because he wanted to become immortal, even though he wasn't really that old by the time he died. I guess by Chinese peasant standards, he would have been pretty old, but he was a nobility. He had access to pretty high-grade medicine and stuff. Alright, moving on to the Han Dynasty. This we're actually going to divide into two periods, Western Han and Eastern Han, because there's one dynasty in the middle that kind of usurped it. Now, Western Han was probably the peak of the dynasty. It conquered several territories and was led by very competent emperors such as Emperor Wu and Emperor Gaozu. They conquered the Joseon dynasty of Korea and the Nanyue kingdom of Vietnam. So they established the first Chinese dynasties that dominated the southern areas like Vietnam and even in the northeastern territories like Korea. It also held off the Xiongnu people for a considerably long period of time, but would eventually be usurped by a powerful minister named Wang Mang. So I think we can sit that as a double S tier because that was the peak of China for several hundred years. Like after that, no dynasty would be able to replicate it for over 500 years. So let's put that at double S. Now, speaking of that usurper Wang Mang, after he overthrew the Han dynasty, he ended up establishing the very short-lived Qin dynasty, which existed for about the same period of time as the Qin dynasty did, and it would eventually also be overthrown in a very quick amount of time and replaced with the Eastern Han. He tried to reform China in many different ways, but he went about it horribly. He established a huge border against the Xiongnu people, and that caused a lot of military pressure on them. So the whole thing fell apart pretty fast after that. And there was still a lot of people who favored the Eastern Han dynasty and the Liu family who ruled it. So after, well, pretty much just a couple years after that, the whole thing would fall apart into peasant rebellions and general warlords, but it would pretty quickly be resolved by the Eastern Han dynasty's establishment. So I think we should put Qin over here at, kind of split between putting it at a C, D, and E. I think it would fit as a E tier, because they tried to do stuff so they don't technically deserve to be at the F tier with Qin, but it wasn't really that great because they did a lot of incompetent things like throwing hundreds of thousands of soldiers at the Xiongnu border, and they didn't really do that much to relieve the economy that was being drained as a result. Now, moving on to the Eastern Han Dynasty, this was a pretty quiet period in Chinese history because after the Qin Dynasty was overthrown, the whole thing slowly started to go downhill. It was pretty quiet for the first century, but during the second century of the Eastern Han Dynasty, it just kind of it went down, 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 and the eunuch factions who controlled the government would start to take more power from child emperors, and then the Yellow Turban Rebellion broke out, and it caused so many people to become autonomous. It basically went to another Eastern Zhou dynasty, and it just it caused the establishment of the Three Kingdoms and all that. People probably know about that. It wasn't really, it was really bad for the people of China at the time. So I think we should put the Eastern Han Dynasty down at the C tier. Now we're moving on into the Three Kingdoms era, but this will be quick. Since we're kind of going over the Three Kingdoms of the era, we should start with the kind of like the more legitimate ruler, Cao Wei, or officially just Wei. Now this one, it held the most powerful territories, but eventually it would just be overthrown by its own ministers, the Sima clan, who would establish the Jin dynasty. So I think we should go ahead and just set it down very quickly and put it down at the B tier. Now, immediately after that, we're going to move on to Eastern Wu, which there's not a whole lot to say about this one. It only controlled a small part of southern China, and it wasn't really effective at overthrowing the other two kingdoms. It didn't make very many gains, but it did establish the city of Nanjing. However, it wasn't called that at the time. But its ministers were extremely corrupt after only a few years, and after Sun Xian's death, the emperor just became very deposable and weak figures. So we should put, well, I guess we could call it Eastern Wu. I'm just going to call it Wu for the sake of saving marker. So we're going to put Wu down at the C tier. Because during Sun Xian's reign, it was a pretty powerful kingdom. But after that, it just kind of went down and it didn't really get any better. So now we're going to move on into the Shu Han Kingdom. Now this one was probably the weakest and the worst out of the three kingdoms, because they wanted to restore the Han Dynasty, but they went about it terribly. They only had 2 emperors, and after that, second emperor took his reign, the whole thing fell down because of a eunuch named Huang Hao, who became the favorite eunuch of the emperor. And during his reign, I think that the whole thing, well, not necessarily during his reign, more like during his kind of like control of the government, it just kind of really fell apart. But I think that we should just put it down at a, yeah, let's go ahead and put it down at an F tier. Shu Han was not a good kingdom at all. We'll stop it after the Jin Dynasty, and then I'll do more of it later. Because right now we're going to go through like the early portion of China and then the early imperial period. So for this, we're going to divide the Jin Dynasty into the Western and Eastern Jin, and we're also going to mention the Tuba. I don't really know how to say it. We'll just call it Wei or Northern Wei. But we're going to go over those 2 dynasties. So for the Western Jin, it was very powerful initially, but after the reign of the first emperor and the second emperor came in, it quickly fell apart because of the War of the Princes, when several princes wanted to take more power for themselves by raising Xianbei armies that existed in northern China, and that caused it to collapse really quickly because the emperor was, well, he was disabled, he wasn't really fit to rule, and because of that, the princes were able to take control, but their whole control in the government didn't last very long, and that would cause the whole thing to fall apart into different dynasties. Well, not necessarily dynasties, more like northern territories that would try to conquer the southern Jin. So we'll go ahead and put Western Jin down at the C tier. Actually, no, B tier, because it was good initially, but it fell apart after the first emperor died. Former Qin dynasty, which conquered all of the other northern territories and almost conquered the Jin and united China. However, they were defeated at the Battle of Fei River, so we'll go ahead and put them down at the E tier because they were pretty strong, but they got defeated really bad just because of their overall military incompetence. So let's go ahead and slap former Qin there. Put Northern Wei through here. Northern Wei ended up outliving the Jin and some of the southern dynasties, which we'll go over in the next video. The Wei, they conquered the northern territories, and then they kind of continued to try and war against the Song and Jin dynasties, and also the Qi and Liang dynasties. So we'll go ahead and put them down at a C tier, because Wei didn't really do all that much, but that was actually where the Mulan movie was starred, which I thought was pretty cool. Let's go ahead and put Northern Wei right here. And then lastly, oh crap, I put Eastern Jin at the B tier. Actually, it kind of fits. We should put the Western Jin down at the C tier. I don't know why I put it as Eastern Jin. That's because after the collapse of the northern territories, the Jin actually became fairly stable and were able to conquer some of the northern territories for themselves and get it back, such as the Shandong region from the Yan Kingdom. And after that, they were pretty stable, and they set up the framework for the dynasties that would come after that in southern China. So I think that is a pretty good place to end it at. But that's all for right now. I will upload later, maybe today, maybe tomorrow. But yeah, that's it. Bye.